Well, if you've seen the first class that we made, it was largely about leadership and how to lead as a creative person. And that class launched, and I was so happy to get to do it. But I've been wondering about it. I've been wondering if it was missing another piece. The great thing about that moment of getting that class together was it was maybe like a 3/4 of a year into my understanding of Silicon Valley and the tech ecosystem across the nation. And I was still learning. I was like, that curve, learning kind of thing. I realized one piece I was missing was the most key skill in leadership, which is listening after you've led. And I began to wonder, was it fitting was it going to help people who were leading? Could it do a good job? At that same time, I began hearing this phrase, unconscious bias, all over the tech ecosystem. Unconscious bias, I know that. It's something where your brain thinks this is okay because everyone is doing it and it seems to make sense, but suddenly you say, is that the right thing? In this case, it was a question of, in Silicon Valley, this diversity in tech, hashtag diversity in tech concern. Are there enough women being represented in the tech ecosystem? And so I looked back at the class we made at Skillshare. I looked back at everything I'd done in the year, and I asked myself, was I helping that? Or was I just like everyone else with my unconscious bias? Was I male focused, or was I balance focused? And I found that I was male focused. And I wondered why. And it began a search to understand how that happened. So people wonder how bias occurs. And did I do something wrong? I feel bad. Did I do something wrong? Situations create biases or the outcome of bias. For instance, when I first came to Silicon Valley, I was introduced to 20 designers across the ecosystem. 19 of them were men. So if you asked 19 men to introduce you to more designers, they're going to introduce you to people like themselves, so more men. And all it took was asking a woman, asking a person of color. People of different backgrounds came all around me. But the most important thing is that the conversations got better. It isn't a question of how to make things right. It's a question of how to do things better. The beauty of unconscious bias is you think you're doing the best way possible because you're taking methods and they worked and you're doing that. And so it was my realization that we had to bring in better ideas. If you wind the clock back to like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, only a few kind of people used computers, but now because of smartphones, everyone uses a computer. And so the computer has to accommodate lots of kinds of people. And if a certain kind of person makes that certain kind of tool on a certain kind of smartphone, it's going to have inside it biases for the person that made them. And so now you have someone else who's a bit different, and they're using that thing and they're like, man, this doesn't feel right. This was designed for someone who thinks like that. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, it isn't a nice to have, it's a need to have, and not a need to have just out of moral issues, which do exist. It's practical, it's better thinking. It leads to better communities, it leads to new opportunities. And so in the Design and Tech Report, certain businesses are highlighted for being inclusive. Whether it is Little Bits, a company that makes a genderless STEM toy. It counteracts this long-term held idea that computers were boys' toys, and opens up to all genders. To the work of Tristan Walker to address a simple problem that I had no idea, that if you have coarse curly hair when you shave, it leaves little nodules and it's pretty uncomfortable, and to design a product for that community. That's an example of products, startups addressing it. But you can also be an artist and make a huge difference for a community. There's a photographer in San Francisco named Helena Price, who launched something called the Techies Project, which counteracts the stereotype that all techies are white young men wearing hoodies. And yes, there are tons of them, and you can watch them on TV and stereotype even further. But when you visit her project, you see photographs of people of all backgrounds in the technology economy, all ages participating in the technology economy. And you begin to question, did what you think, was your bias correct? And you break your unconscious bias. If you're an engineer, like I was an engineer, it's very easy to stay in your sort of code world, but the best engineers today are people engineers, people that can work with other people. And you work with other people, the only way you'll get better with people is to be with more kinds of people. In the same way for an engineer, you want to know different software languages, know different people. In the case of your designer, you can't help but gravitate to a certain kind of design, certain kind of design people, certain kind of design heroes. But once you pluck away at the history of design, you'll find incredible biases. You'll find that most design histories are built on white men. And you wonder, well, weren't there like other kind of designers out there? And so pick apart that, and you'll find some of the designers we miss. We always talk about Charles Eames, but there was Charles and Ray Eames, and people will often say Ray Eames was more badass than Charles Eames. Artists that I love are the ones that I find are the most inclusive. So there's something about the arts that creates inclusion, that's vital. So if you're an engineer, hang out with more artists who are in that space. And for designers who are so stuck on pure design, just get out of your thing. I think to get to the listening phase and to see if what we made matches up and trying to figure out how can we improve it does take us back to curiosity. It's kind of like in a Sound of Music, it takes us back to Do. I guess I'm now even more curious how to integrate more inclusive practices. I love social media because I can learn, I can stalk different people's thinking. Sorry, that's a bad word, but what is that person saying? One time I read something about how there was a person who will not accept being on a panel if there are no people of color or are women on these. This happened to be a white man. And I said, that's a good idea. So half a year ago when I was invited to a panel, I said, well, I'm not going to be on this panel. I feel very lucky that I'm Asian and an Asian male. I call it kind of like being a type O minority. I've gotten to experience what it's like to be included, but not fully included. And just even more recently, just to get to be more awake around inclusion and looking back at things I cared about to make it a more inclusive world. I had this great accident in the late 90s where I was at MIT. The chancellor calls me up and says, Professor Maeda, I'd like you to now lead the Culture and Race Committee. And it was in that committee where I began to see the world differently. I began to see that even at MIT, all kinds of inequities were happening on campus to all kinds of people. Didn't matter what color your skin was or your background. But it wasn't until a Native American student came to the committee. He was sitting in our big council, it's like a Jedi moment, he's sitting and he's talking about experiences he's had. And so I tried to say, well, I'm Asian, so I've experienced things. I've had a bottle thrown at me. I've had people call me all kinds of things, and that's uncomfortable. And I know where you're coming from. He looked back at me, and he said to me, you have no idea what I've gone through. You've experienced immigrant racism. I've experienced indigenous people racism. It's completely different. It was from that moment I realized that everyone's hurt is different. And you have to listen to that hurt, because it's always different. And only until we can listen to everyone's hurt can we move past it. The neat thing about listening it's also coded with, can I hear? Because some people can't. Think about seeing, some people can't see. So there's this wonderful bias in that word, so I apologize. I would say that we all can do a better job of sensing by leaving our maker world. Do you know what that is? You're a maker, you're a Skillshare, you're like typing away, you're drawing away, you're making, you love making because making is awesome. And when you're making, you have to shut out the world. And when you shut out the world and you make, and you have that moment, that kind of Excalibur moment, you gotta wake up and say, well, what's this doing? And not just do people like it, is it in tune? Can it make a difference? Next time, can I do better? In my career, I've always questioned everything I've made. I advise it as a general habit.